Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Alexander Philippides, and I'm the program associate at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. At the museum, we are pleased to offer this program free of charge. We appreciate everyone's support however you are able, as we do not receive town, state, or federal funding. I'd first like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Pawcusset land, as Westport was taken from the tribe in the 17th century. Of course, the Pawcusset people are still part of our community, but it's important to note that we all have benefited from the ancestral lands. The museum's mission is to make history whole, and our collective story begins with the first peoples of this region. To get into our topic today, the museum is pleased to welcome Dr. Sonia Gomez, an assistant professor of 20th century American history at Santa Clara University. Dr. Gomez has an academic focus in race and ethnic relations, migration and diaspora, and gender and sexuality. Her first book is Picture Bride, War Bride, The Role of Marriage in Shaping Japanese America. She's currently working on a new project exploring interracial female friendship, girlhood, and letter writing during the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. I hope my viewers will join me today in welcoming Dr. Sonia Gomez. Dr. Gomez, it's so nice to have you on today. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So could you tell us a little bit about what you'll be talking about today?
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to join you at the museum. It is my first book, Picture Bride, War Bride, The Role of Marriage in Shaping Japanese America. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about, or give you a little bit of a sneak peek of what's in the book, and talk a little bit about how I came to this topic. Should I start?
Awesome. Yeah, let me set you up right there. Go for it.
Okay, perfect. Yes, again, thank you all for joining and for watching. I'm going to give you a kind of snippet of what is in the book, published at NYU Press, and talk a little bit about how I came to this project. Picture Bride, War Bride, The Role of Marriage in Shaping Japanese America, is based on the premise that gender shapes immigration policies and practices. Ideas about gender, ideas about sexuality shape immigration. And in turn, immigration policies and practices also shape ideas about gender, right? It's a reciprocal relationship. And I call this a gendered diaspora. So to illustrate my point specifically, I look at marriage and how marriage intersected with immigration policies and patterns in the case of Japanese Americans in the US. Marriage played a critical role in shaping Japanese immigration to the US because it created a narrow path of entry for women who were otherwise racially excluded. These, what I call pockets of inclusion, reflect a historical tension between American foreign policy that sought to maintain, and in the post-World War II period, reestablish friendly ties with Japan, and anti-Japanese racism, which was especially prominent where I'm at right now on the West Coast. I'm sitting here in my office in Santa Clara, California, in the Bay Area. But these pockets of inclusion were indeed pockets, and those pockets were pretty slim because they reflected women's subordinated status within immigration policies and practices. And in the pre-war period, Japanese women did not have a pathway to citizenship. So although it created a pathway for arrival, it didn't create a pathway to citizenship. So I'm going to talk about picture brides and war brides, and this is how I illustrate my argument throughout the book, is focusing on these two patterns, migration patterns of Japanese women. The first picture brides, what we call picture brides, were women who arrived between 1908 and 1924, and they arrived as the brides, the wives of Japanese immigrant men who were already in the US. And then, excuse me, I jump ahead to the post-World War II period from 1945 to 1952, and I focus on quote-unquote war brides. And these were Japanese women who were once again admitted to the US during times of racial exclusion, but specifically as the brides and wives of American servicemen. So in the first case, they're coming as the wives of Japanese men already here. In the second case, they're coming as the wives of American servicemen who were stationed in Japan after World War II. Okay, so before I dive in, I want to share a little bit of personal history and how I came to this project. So it actually began as an undergraduate paper. When I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, I was a history major. I took an immigration history class, and one of the options for our final paper was to write an immigration history about our family, for those of us who have immigrant backgrounds. And I knew right away that I wanted to write about my grandmother. My grandmother is Michiko Ikeda, who is right here on the left. My left. Wearing a kind of long skirt. She's here with a friend sometime in the late 1940s. She was born in Osaka, Japan. Her family came from the Amami Islands originally. She met my grandfather, Luis Olivares, here on the right, sometime in the late 40s, early 1950s, or actually late 40s, most likely, at a GI club in Nara, Japan, where my grandfather was stationed. They married in Japan. They had one daughter and then immigrated to the US. And this is a photo of them in the early 1960s. This photo is taken in LA once they were here in the US. So I wanted to write about her and her immigration experience. She passed when I was pretty young, and I had a lot of questions about who she was and what her life was like in Japan and what prompted her to come to the US. And so I sat with my professor to ask questions about, what sources should I be looking at? What should I be reading? And when I told her about my grandmother, she said, "Oh, your grandmother's a Japanese war bride." And I had never heard this term before. And it was just really moving, because I didn't really consider her as part of this larger pattern. I didn't realize. I thought she was, just an individual who came here on her own, which, she did, but there were thousands of other women like her. And so I wanted to know more about these women. And so as I started reading the historiography on Japanese Americans in the US, I noticed a kind of glaring gap. And that is that the war brides were not part of this larger history of the Japanese in America, for a variety of reasons that I touch on in this talk, but also in the book. So I wanted to write about her and the thousands of women like her who came to the US. But I was also really struck by the similarities between the war brides who come in the post-World War II period and the quote unquote picture brides. Although their husbands come from a different demographic, there are so many similarities in their immigration patterns. And so nobody had really written about this except for Evelyn Nakano Glenn, who wrote Issei Nisei War Bride in the 80s, which was is a kind of phenomenal text because she draws on oral histories of all three generations of women, but it hadn't really been written about since Glenn's work. And so I wanted to write about picture brides and war brides in connection to one another. And then that prompted me to think about how marriage and gender and sexuality, compulsory heterosexuality, is shaped or shapes immigration law, and then immigration patterns, and vice versa. So that's how I came to this project. It has a very personal. I have a personal connection, but it also blossomed into this kind of larger analysis that spans the 20th century. So to illustrate my point about how marriage created these pockets of inclusion, I want to start by sharing two timelines. This timeline that I'm showing you here is a kind of rough sketch of U.S. citizenship and immigration laws that specifically shaped the Japanese experience in the U.S. So I'm going to go through them really quickly, and then I'll show you another timeline. So naturalization law 1790, the naturalization law limits the process of naturalization to only those who are considered free white persons. Now, so that means only those who are deemed free, meaning not enslaved, and only those who are deemed white are able to naturalize, become citizens if they're born outside of the US. Now, that changes in the Reconstruction period with the amendments and also with the Wong Kim Ark case. But by and large, that the naturalization law prevents Asian immigrants from naturalizing until 1952. In 1887, there is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And once the Chinese are excluded, Japanese men began arriving in large numbers in the 1880s. In 1908, the US and Japan shake hands on this gentleman's agreement, shake kind of metaphorical hands on this gentleman's agreement that essentially the US agrees to allow Japanese women to enter, while Japan agrees to limit the number of passports for Japanese immigrant men. And I'll talk about the gentleman's agreement in more depth in a few minutes. Then the Alien Land Laws in 1913 and 1920 prevent Japanese immigrants and their children from owning land or holding long-term leases. 1920, Ozawa v. US, reifies Japanese exclusion from naturalization. It essentially deems Japanese Americans as non-white and therefore not able to naturalize. And then in 1924, we have sweeping immigration legislation that is incredibly exclusive. It essentially bans all of immigration from Asia and also puts large bans on parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. And then the kind of ultimate act of exclusion is during World War II, when Japanese Americans in the US are forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in incarceration camps during the war from 1942 to about 1945. So then in the post-World War II period, right after 1945, we see a shift in immigration policy, this quote unquote opening up, right? We have this period, this long period of exclusion, all of these exclusion laws that kind of lead up one to the other up until World War II. And then there's a shift. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act essentially lifts the ban on naturalization from Asia, mostly Japan. And then in 1965, the Hart-Celler Act essentially abolishes the 1924 National Origins Act, which restricts immigration from Asia and parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. So this is a kind of quick, brief sketch of U.S. citizenship and immigration laws. And I like to call this a timeline from a male perspective, right? These are laws that would shape men's immigration and women's to an extent. Now, here's the same timeline, but there's two points I want to make. So if we look at this previous timeline, we see that there's all of these acts of exclusion until World War II right here, and then we see a kind of opening up. But if we look at immigration, or if we look at this timeline from a woman's perspective, there are two instances where Japanese women are permitted to enter the US when men are not, and only as the wives of men. So the first is the 1908 Gentleman's Agreement, which I mentioned earlier. So that largely in the historiography is seen as a agreement that led to the exclusion of Japanese immigrant men. And it did, right? There was a decline in the arrival of Japanese men. But what it did is it also allowed those Japanese men who were already here in the US and somewhat established to then sponsor wives from Japan who can join them. And about 35,000 women arrived via the gentleman's agreement. So it's not a small number. And that led to the formation of Japanese American families, the birth of the second generation Nisei. And so that is a really kind of foundational moment in Japanese American history. So I call the agreement not merely a mechanism of exclusion, but one of both inclusion and exclusion. So one of the things I'm interested in the book is thinking about these immigration laws and policies as kind of paradoxical, right? Although they are exclusive and they are excluding a large number of people, there also are these smaller pathways in which people are included. And I'm kind of equally interested in like why people are included during periods of exclusion. So that's the gentleman's agreement. And then the second would be in 1947, right? So 2 years after World War II, the Alien Brides Act is passed that allows Japanese women to enter the US as brides. It's pretty limited because it has like a time stipulation. I think it's 30 days, if I can't remember correctly. But it is the kind of first piece of legislation that quote unquote allows Japanese immigrants to enter the US, right? So even before we get to the McCarran-Walter Act or the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, we have this legislation that's allowing women to enter. This time, however, they're entering as brides to American servicemen who were stationed in Japan. And most of the American servicemen, well, the American servicemen they marry come from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, right? So they're marrying white Americans, Black Americans. In my grandmother's case, she's marrying a Mexican American from Texas, Puerto Ricans, Italian. So they come, so this second wave of Japanese women to arrive lead to what I call like a post-World War II kind of mixed race Japanese America, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, I want to show these two, I like to show these two images because we call the first wave picture brides, right? That is kind of what the historiography calls them. Kind of take that for granted, I think. And I want to just describe a little bit of why we call them picture brides. So the reason why they're called picture brides in the historiography is because of the method for, or I guess part of the process when they arrived. So when looking at the earlier period, after the gentleman's agreement, when a Japanese man, an immigrant man who was here in the US, wanted to bring his wife, if he had the financial means, the time and the money, he could go to Japan and find a wife and, bring her back with him. But a lot of times they did not have the means, right? And so they would write family in Japan. They'd match with a wife, with a woman who's maybe from their village or a nearby village, which was very which aligned with kind of marriage practices in Japan at the time. So they would, match with a woman. They'd correspond across the Pacific. They'd share letters and photos. And then she would arrive in the US at San Francisco or Seattle port and go through an interrogation process with immigration officials. And immigration officials would ask, a kind of standard questions, which I kind of talk about in more detail in the book. But they would also confiscate the pictures, the photos that she had. So she would arrive with very little belongings, but she typically had a photo of her husband, and that's how she was able to kind of tell who he was. And vice versa. He would arrive at the port to go pick her up, and he'd also have a photo of her. And when they went through this interrogation process, immigration officials would take those photos and affix them to a scrapbook and file them with their files. And so these two images come from case files at the National Archives Record and Administration, NARA, at their San Bruno location, which is here in the Bay Area. And so the one on the left is a photo that's been cropped, but the one on the right kind of is a photo that I took when I was at the archives that shows how these photos are, kind of pasted onto these scrapbooks and entered into their case files. So even now, researchers can visit NARA in San Bruno and see these thousands and thousands and thousands of case files that have these personal photographs of the bride and groom. And some people, when I give talks kind of locally in the Bay Area, are interested in kind of going and looking for their grandparents or great grandparents' photos. Um, okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the picture bride. So once they arrived, right? Now, when I say there was a, you know, marriage created this narrow path of inclusion, that doesn't mean that they were, wholeheartedly welcomed into the US, right? It was a very contentious inclusion. And essentially came down to state versus federal tension. So in the on the West Coast, in California, Washington, Oregon, but really, really on the West Coast in California, there was a very powerful xenophobic sentiment, a very powerful anti-Asian sentiment amongst politicians, labor union leaders, and ordinary folks. That movement had resulted in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And once the Chinese were excluded, many of the anti-Asian politicians and labor union leaders then kind of turned their attention to the Japanese. And at the same time, Roosevelt's cabinet was not inclined to exclude the Japanese at the federal level as they did with the Chinese, and partly because Japan is rising as a kind of world power. At the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, Japan wins a series of wars. They win the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. They defeat Russia, which is the first time a non-white nation state defeats a white nation state, and they are a rising military but also industrial power. And so there's a tension between the federal level, Roosevelt and his cabinet not wanting to offend or wanting to kind of maintain a friendly relationship with this rising power in the East, with also trying to appease in a lot of ways the rising anti-Asian sentiment on the West Coast. And so that's how we get the gentleman's agreement. It emerges after a kind of diplomatic disagreement, to put it lightly, between the US and Japan. After, in 1906, San Francisco had the great earthquake, and the San Francisco School Board took that opportunity to implement some anti-Japanese policies that had been kind of in the works. And one of those policies was to segregate Japanese school children and make them attend a quote unquote Oriental school where most of the Chinese students had been forced to attend. And Japanese parents were upset with this. They reached out to their embassy. They also reached out to the Japanese press, Japanese American press. And Japan accused the US of violating an earlier treaty that guaranteed Japanese nationals rights in the US. And so there was a kind of diplomatic a disagreement that was played out in the press, and that led to this gentleman's agreement between the US and Japan. Again, just to recap, that agreement was to limit the number of Japanese men allowed in the US by limiting the issuance of passports in Japan, and allowing women to immigrate as wives of Japanese men. Okay. So as I was saying earlier, the arrival of Japanese women presented new challenges for the anti-Asian, anti-Japanese movement. Because with the arrival of women means the arrival of children and the emergence of Japanese American families. And this is a poster from, let's see if I can see, Senator Phelan, James Phelan, who was San Francisco mayor twice, I believe, and U.S. Senator once. He ran for re-election in 1920. He didn't win this re-election, but you can see from this poster for his re-election campaign that he's focused on the Japanese population, especially the birth rate, as you can see here to the right, and also the amount of land that the Japanese quote unquote control, either through typically through leasing. And so once Japanese women began arriving as picture brides, the anti-Asian, anti-Japanese movements really starts to focus on women, and as you can see in this image, and starts to attack women specifically in a lot of their rhetoric, based on the fact that women were having babies, and also they were wage earners, but also working on farms and in the agriculture alongside their husbands. So they were a kind of seen as an economic and reproductive threat. And so that is a tension that I unpack in the book, that how these women are, provided a pathway in a way, in a kind of limited sense, and then become targets of the anti-Asian movement. Let's see. Okay, so that is the pre-war period, and I want to jump to the post-World War II period. So we talked about picture brides. Now we're going to talk about war brides, and I like to start by showing. I show this to my students all the time when I'm teaching. I don't know. Almost every class I teach, I find some way to talk about anti-Japanese propaganda and the post-war shift. So these are a few images, anti-Japanese propaganda during World War II from 1942 to 1943. And I chose these three because they each features, Japan is this kind of, it's presented as a male kind of subhuman who, and the U.S. is presented as this kind of white woman who's in distress, who is prey to this quote unquote sexual predator. That's the image that, those are the ideas that these images are trying to evoke. So this is coming in 1942, 1943, and then about 15 years later, 10 to 15 years later, we have these images of the Japanese, right? Mostly women who are war brides, who are the sexual and romantic partners to white men, right? So again, we kind of go from, this is the kind of popular representation of the Japanese as a military, sexual, and violent threat to the US. And then here they are, the romantic partners of Americans. So how do we go from there to here? So the first the first war bride to enter the U.S. Came in 1947. So wherever U.S. soldiers were stationed in the European theater of operations and the Pacific theater of operations, they met and married women. Talking about these relationships, the marriages. There were only marriages, right? American servicemen and civilians as well engaged in different types of relationships with women everywhere they went, right? The most fleeting were in brothels, and then, of course, the more permanent were the marriages. So they were having relationships with women everywhere they went. So when I'm talking about war brides, I'm specifically talking about only those women who actually married and entered the U.S. That leaves out a large swath of women. So with that said, the GI Bride Act in 1945 was passed that expedited the entry of women, foreign women who were the brides, fiancés, and wives of American servicemen. So this is the kind of first post-World War II legislation in terms of immigration. But the GI Bride Act really mostly applied to European brides. I think the largest benefactors were British war brides who came over, but also French, Italian, some Australian. The War Bride Act of 1945 excluded anyone who was excluded by the previous 1924 Act. So essentially that meant Japanese women were excluded. And then 2 years later, Congress passed the Alien Bride Act in 1947, and that's the one I mentioned earlier in the timeline, that allowed Japanese women to enter. Again, it was very limited because it imposed a 30-day time frame. In addition, Japanese war brides arrived via special bills. So one case that I talk about, which is one of many I came across, was a woman named Mitsuko Ito, who was actually a fiance to a young man who was based out in Chicago, and they weren't able to marry. He ended up getting shipped to Korea. And so he wrote his parents, who then wrote to their congressional rep and had a special bill passed that allowed her to come to the US. So we see a lot of that in the archives of servicemen who are stationed abroad, who are writing their family, their friends, and asking for help. They're Black servicemen who were stationed in Japan, but also in the European theater of operations, are writing to the NAACP and asking for help. So these men are activists in a way who are seeking help and trying to get special legislation passed or figure out it's kind of immigration laws, a complicated web, figure out ways in which to have their brides join them in the US. And then in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act essentially lifts the ban on Japanese immigration. So after 1952, it becomes much easier for Japanese women to immigrate to the US. In fact, I believe my grandmother came over in 1952, or was it 54? I'm forgetting, but she came over when it was far easier at that point. Now, before the women left Japan, they were encouraged to attend what they called bride schools. Bride schools kind of popped up in areas of Japan where there was a large US military presence. And the idea was to teach women about the American way of life, teach them how to be American housewives, how to, they were taught some English, a little bit of history, things like that nature, civics. But really the classes focused on how to use American appliances, how to use a coffee percolator, how to use iron, how to swaddle a baby, how to make an American style bed. So there was a lot of emphasis on the domestication of these women in a domestication American style. And this interestingly was similarly, I guess, not quite a bride school, but in the picture bride era, right? So in the 1908 to 1924 era, those picture brides who left Japan to join their husbands in the US, many of them also attended workshops and classes before they left Japan to prepare them for life in America. But those classes were held by Japanese officials. And that was in a way to prep them so that they could be, quote unquote, Japan wanted to send their best, right? And so they were kind of prepped on how to present themselves in a respectable manner, but also because they would be ostensibly representing Japan. So both instances, women are kind of, quote unquote, prepped to enter the US as brides. But as the kind of post-World War II moment kind of leans into the Cold War moment, the relationship between American servicemen and Japanese women kind of takes on kind of larger meaning in a lot of ways. And I like to illustrate this with a quote from Haru Reischauer, who was the Japanese wife of Edwin Reischauer, who was the US ambassador to Japan. In 1961, so we're kind of in the middle of the Cold War, or I don't know, the height of the Cold War. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So she goes to Japan. Both of them, they go on tour in Japan, and Haru visits a number of bride schools. And at one, she gives this, during her speech, she says, "Today, you and I are just carrying this relationship a little further. We have an important role to play in international relations and can do much to further better understanding between our two countries. We can do this by being good wives to our husbands and good mothers to our children, and also by becoming good American citizens, bringing something of Japanese culture with us to America." So here it's very obvious that Haru is promoting this idea that these relationships are not just kind of mere, kind of personal relationships, that they have these broader foreign relations meaning, right? This larger value attached to them, right? That they are a kind of microcosm of the relationship between the U.S. and Japan, one that is very gendered, right, and one that is one in which Japan is subordinated to America, just as Japanese wives and wives are subordinated to their husbands. In addition to the bride schools in Japan, Japanese women, once they were in the U.S., began to form these Japanese war bride clubs. And these clubs were created to create community. Many of the women were, they were in a foreign land, didn't speak very good English, and were homesick. And so these clubs were originally kind of designed in a way to um, to respond to some of those challenges that the war brides were facing in the U.S. And so here is an example from the Roanoke Times: Japanese war brides to form club as East-West relations promotion. So as though these clubs provided like an outlet when women would come together, they could speak their native language, they'd have tea, they'd talk about child rearing, whatever. They would share their experiences, just be in community with other women who had very similar experiences. But these clubs also take on a different kind of meaning as well. Like, aside from being in community with other women like you, they are now kind of assigned, just like how do speech reference, this larger value, in a way, not larger, but a more symbolic value of reuniting or strengthening the tie between the US and Japan. But what was interesting about these clubs and about war bride communities in general that sprung up across the US was that they were they, in a lot of ways, inherited, these women, what's the word, inherited or became embedded into their husband's kind of racial and social class, if that makes sense. So if a woman was married to like a white high ranking officer, right, she may not be close friends with a woman who was married to a lower ranking officer, right? So there was a lot of divisions within these Japanese war bride clubs based on their husband's race, but also their kind of socioeconomic class. And so one of the things I found when I was doing this research, especially around the war bride clubs and the post-World War II communities, is that women who married Black men, although they were in the archives, there was lots of letters in the NAACP, there was a few oral histories. When I would go to these events, I went to a few of these Japanese Japanese war bride clubs, meetings they had. Women who married Black GIs were always absent. And that kind of got me thinking, like, well, where are these women? And, women who married Black GIs, but also maybe women who married like other men of color, like my grandmother. And so what I found in the archive through oral histories and through little snippets in the press was that Japanese women who married Black GIs were oftentimes shunned by women who married white Americans. And so again, like I said before, these women became embedded in their husbands' racial communities. And so in a lot of ways, what's the word I want to say? They became embedded in their husband's racial community, and in some ways kind of inherited. It's not quite the right word, but that's all I can think of right now. Inherited the kind of social norms, right? And so we found, and this is a article from Ebony. I believe this is Ebony. I have a hard copy here somewhere, but this article, The Loneliest Brides in America, although, kind of perhaps a bit, hyperbolic, but does talk about how these women faced a lot of challenges. Not only were they shunned by the Japanese women who married white American servicemen, but they were also shunned by Japanese Americans who were here in the US. So there's one example that I write about in the book about a woman having a hard time shopping in Japantown, the way she was treated when she had her Black children with her versus how she was treated when she was alone, right? So, so the women who married Black GIs faced, in a lot of ways, inherited their husband's racial status. I guess I don't have it. And the other thing I wanted to say is, although these relationships, like how do you, right, a Japanese woman married to a white man, and the relationships that are featured here. This is the one in the middle is a film from 1952. The one on the right, a film from 1957, starring Marlon Brando, which was originally a novel written by James Michener. And the one on the far left, 1951, this scene was a Japanese American magazine that ran pretty shortly after World War II. But inside is an article written by a white American serviceman about his Japanese war bride. So in the media, what you mostly see, aside from the Black press, is Japanese women married to white Americans, right? And so the idea that East meets West, and these marriages are solidifying the relationship between the U.S. and Japan, that whole kind of propaganda was based on a very specific race and gender pairing, right? Japanese women and white American men. For Japanese women who married Black men, that kind of representational value was not assigned to those relationships. They weren't plastered on, Life magazine as East meets West story. And I wanted to end with this quote from the magazine, from a Japanese war bride who married a Black GI. She says, "It seems that the Japanese girls who married white soldiers got very high hat and drew a color line on us and our husbands." Let's see. So I will end it there. 43. I'm hoping I have a minute. I have a few. I'm hoping I have questions.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say that was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure I speak for myself, but our audience as well, saying that I'm very much looking forward to getting a hold of a copy and reading about some of this. I myself am very interested in this topic, and I haven't read too much literature on the ways that it intersected with the experience of Black Americans and Latin Americans. But kind of speaking on that, I do have my first question has to do with sort of the differences between these two generations of women. I personally, my great aunt Michiko Ishikawa Gould came here in '52, and she came with a man who was from Rhode Island, and she went to Rhode Island. And while you're talking about that first generation, there was a lot of centralization in California, especially, is my understanding, and you kind of see that broken up during incarceration because people are being forced out of their homes on the West Coast. Do you think that sort of fragmentation of the Japanese female diaspora, especially coming home with men who were all over the United States, was almost, maybe not purposeful, but this sort of contributed to like these communities like Little Tokyo, for example, in California, not growing in the same way they originally did, sort of this dilution of this Japanese American culture being more associated with the culture of their husbands?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think so. The post World War II migration of war brides, it means, so one of the things I'm trying to do is to kind of incorporate these women and their children into this like larger history of Japanese America, right? And you're right, it is more dispersed, right? Because these women are they're all over, right? They're in rural parts of the country, they're in the South, they're also in major cities as well. So I will say that not that Japanese war brides reinvigorated necessarily kind of older Japantowns or Chinatowns, but there was, from you know, there was a movement towards those places. Like, for instance, I could think of one woman specifically who, and I cannot even remember exactly where her husband was from or where she ended up, but they ended up moving to Seattle so that she could be closer to a Japantown or a kind of Japanese community, or more broadly Asian community. And that had to do with having access to like groceries and certain things that she, wanted to cook and whatnot in restaurants. So I do feel like there are these cases in which there was a kind of gravitational pull towards major cities and areas that had a kind of larger Asian presence for these women. But there were still those who were kind of in more rural areas, right, who didn't make their way to these kind of urban centers. And so I think your question was about, does it dilute, or what? Can you repeat that like last part?
Kind of like, I'm curious if sort of this process by which women were encouraged, might be the wrong word, but we're coming across to the United States through this process that sort of had people all across the country in sort of less concentrated communities. Though, as you mentioned, of course, there was still a greater concentration in these already existing communities.
Yeah.
Do you think that was maybe part of this process of, I mean, you kind of see with the Chinese Exclusion Act and these laws forbidding Asian immigration, this sort of process of trying to Americanization, trying to remove people from their culture of origin?
I mean, yes, I think it's different also because of the like circumstances of like their arrival. Like
Mhm.
they are arriving as wives of non-Japanese men. So I think in a place, especially for those who are in places where there's not like a large Japanese American or more broadly Asian American population. So they are going to be like in because they're involved, because they're in these interracial marriages, and they are in some cases probably like the only person, the only Japanese person maybe in their small town. For those who went to like small towns, um, will have less of, or be less rooted in kind of Asian American and Japanese American specific communities. And I think that has to do with
Mhm.
the interracial aspect of their marriages. The interesting thing is, um, in the research, a, there is a statistic that a large number of these women actually married Nisei men. So they married Japanese American men. But I have not come across one woman who has married a Japanese American man. I don't know. I'm pretty, I mean, according to, the research, that was the largest population. I don't know if that's actually true now that we've done more research and we know more. But also those women, are, presumably embedded into Japanese American communities, and so are like not quote unquote standing out, right? So where we can be like, oh, she was a war bride. We don't know because she's, just embedded into these communities. There was something else I wanted to say about the interracial marriage aspect about, um, oh yeah, I remember having a conversation with a woman who I want to say grew up in the South, and maybe it was like the Northeast. Anyways, she grew up, her mother was like the only Japanese American woman that she knew, or Japanese woman she knew. And so she grew up obviously half Japanese, she's Hapa, but said she always felt very American, right? Because that's what she was exposed to. That was the like predominant, that was the community when she was born and raised, right? And so in a lot of ways, her mother was a kind of an outsider, an anomaly, right? A foreigner. And so she wasn't embedded in those communities, or even just a larger diasporic like community, whether it's Asian American or not. And so I think that has a lot to do with your question is interesting because it has a lot. I feel like we see, I feel like it's pretty significant in shaping the experiences of their children.
Mhm. That's really interesting. And kind of touching on that a little bit, talking about that second generation of women. How would you say the experience of Japanese men and women, Japanese American men and women who are already in the United States, going through evacuation and then incarceration, do you think that had any influence on?
Oh
Of
yeah.
course, I'm sure it stoked a large amount of this discrimination that was already existent. Of course, with these now these new people coming. how would you say it influenced their experience once they got here? These people who had not been in the United States during incarceration.
Yeah. So you're asking how Issei, Nisei, Sansei, kind of how the arrival of war brides kind of shaped their experience, or how that might have, how incarceration might have shaped their response to the war brides.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, yes. So I think, I mean, it varies, right? So the first woman to come over is coming over in 1947. That's 2 years after incarceration. So the Japanese Americans in the US are, you know, incredibly traumatized, are trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration. Many of them are no longer on the West Coast. They're in the Midwest and the East Coast. Some, large number make their way back to the West Coast eventually, but they're trying to start their lives and start all over, right? And so I think that there was, in some cases, tension, right? But also just a kind of ambivalence, where they're, in a lot of ways trying to rebuild their lives, and perhaps not too uh, inclined to, build relationships with Japanese women who are just arriving. Um, but I think there are also, what's interesting is the war brides who come over are, that come over in the late 40s, early 50s, are like born in, like they're born in the 20s and 30s. And so they're actually, in terms of age, very similar to like the Nisei at that point. And so I think there's a lot of, so I think though they are technically Issei and they're referred to as Shin Issei, like the new Issei, meaning first generation, I think they have more in common generationally and through their age with the Nisei. And so one example is my own grandmother, where she herself was a war bride. But she had a really good friend named Martha Takahashi, who was Nisei, who had been incarcerated. And so they'd get together, and they had a friendship that even I can remember as a child. So yeah, I think it just really depends, right? That there's going to be tension, because these women are essentially newcomers, and the Japanese Americans are, trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration. So there's going to be tension there, but then there's also going to be friendships, right? And ambivalence as well. So yeah, I think incarceration has been such a uh, incarceration has profoundly shaped the Japanese American experience in the U.S. And I think that also has, in some ways, led to a kind of not a split, but it's led to Japanese war brides kind of not being kind of embedded and part of that historiography, because they didn't experience incarceration, because they came in at a later period. But I'm really interested in thinking about them as part of this like longer history of Japanese immigration that extends beyond the Issei, Nisei, Sansei model, and thinks about Japanese immigration in the post-World War II period. And it obviously looks very different. They're in interracial relationships. They're having mixed race children. They didn't experience incarceration, but I think it can tell us a lot about, kind of the Japanese experience as a whole.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate you sort of diving into these questions and exploring how the lives of these individual people and these groups of people, how we can incorporate them into this larger historiography of Japanese Americans and American immigration and things like that. One last thing I'd like to ask you, so we are running short on time now, is there any upcoming project you'd like to speak on or anything like that?
Oh yeah, great. Yes. So actually this is a great segue, because it's about incarceration. So my next project is, it centers around a woman, an African-American woman, a young woman named Molly Wilson, who is from Boyle Heights, California, which is a neighborhood in LA, east of downtown. Boyle Heights is itself a kind of unique place because it lacked racial covenants in ways that other parts of LA did not. And so it became a very diverse neighborhood. So there were Black Americans, Jewish Americans, mostly Eastern European Jewish Americans, Mexican Americans, and Japanese Americans. I'm not sure if I even said that. Anyway, so Molly Wilson grew up in this very like diverse neighborhood in LA. She had a number of Japanese American friends. And when they were incarcerated, she wrote to her friends and she maintained their friendships and um, she maintained friendships with them through correspondence. And then she saved all of those, most of the letters she saved, about over a dozen friends she wrote to. She saved their letters. And then in 2009, 2010, decades after incarceration, she donated those letters to the Japanese American National Museum, which is based in LA. So I am using those letters to explore incarceration. And the kind of three themes that I'm working with at this point is thinking about the role of letter writing and how important that is to kind of marginalized women, right? Or marginalized people, these being women of color. And just, letter writing as a kind of political act. In the 60s and 70s, we see a lot of like third world feminists, Black feminists talking about letter writing as a kind of praxis of their feminism, right? But these young girls were kind of doing it before it became, it had any of this like political meaning assigned to it. So I'm thinking about letter writing in that way. I'm also thinking about girlhood and just like what it means to be a young, a teenage girl coming of age during incarceration, right? And so I'm exploring, pop culture, dating, even things like menstruation, what that was like. And so just really kind of thinking about the experience of incarceration through girlhood. And then the final, or not final, but the third piece is thinking about interracial female friendship. And particularly thinking about, Molly's, Molly was, from what I could tell, the first to write. Like she was the kind of the glue that like kept, all of these kind of this friend group together, and kind of tied them to Boyle Heights. And so this was a kind of what I'm arguing, in a kind of political act on Molly's behalf, and vice versa, where she is, maintaining, a kind of affective tie to her Japanese American friends at a time when, the Japanese were labeled quote unquote enemy alien, right? And so I'm thinking about what does interracial friendship mean as a political act of solidarity, especially during a special hostile times like World War II incarceration.
That sounds really interesting. I'll certainly be on the lookout
Thank
for
you.
that coming up. I just want to thank you one more time so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit about your work.
Thank you so much, Alexander. This has been great.
All right. Well, thank you everybody so much for watching today. This has been our Chats on the Past program with Dr. Sonia Gomez, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.